For though we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not the weapons of the world. Instead, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We tear down arguments and every presumption set up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Greetings, you're listening to Cantus Firmus. This is Cody Cook, and my guest today is Andrew Kern, who's the author of The Myth of the Social Contract. Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Yourself?
I'm doing all right. Would you mind telling the audience a little bit about your background and what brought you to write this book, The Myth of the Social Contract?
Yeah, so I had been writing quite a bit. Well, this was years ago, maybe 6 to 8 years ago. I was writing a lot and publishing a lot of articles on places like FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, and also on Mises, the Mises Institute, and on antiwar.com, some others. And I noticed a lot of what I liked to write about was social contract theory. And so I ended up with like 4 or 5 like articles that at least were related to that. And so eventually a couple of my friends was starting to kind of publish a book, or their first book. And so I thought about it for myself. And then since I had been writing so much about that social contract theory, I thought that would be the easiest, at least to start with. So then I did some editing and combined like about 5 of my articles, and then wrote some more original content, and we put it all together into a little book.
And what I like about the book, I was just saying this before we started, is that it's brief. It kind of goes through the information, so in a very kind of a distilled format, so you can deal with the questions and the objections. And like I said, to you, I hate writing books that are longer than they need to be. I like to read a book that tells me what I need to know so I can go on with my life. And this is a great, concise book. And so somebody who's listening may know what the social contract is, may not know what the social contract is. Can you explain what the social contract is? When I hear contract, I think of an agreement that people make voluntarily, that they enter into. So when I sign a contract with my cell phone carrier, I don't just get a phone in the mail that I didn't ask for, that I'm forced to use and pay for. I sign an agreement. So is that what a social contract is?
Yeah, well, in my writing, and specifically in this book, I define the social contract, at least for these purposes, is any argument or attempt to justify that the state or government has legitimate or just authority. As in, any argument where a person tries to explain that whatever the state is doing is legitimate, and it could just be, or even the most basic things the state does is legitimate, like just taxing and making laws in general. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm just talking about social contract. There are other definitions of it, but when you're talking about politics in particular, that is the definition you're using implicitly. What else were you asking?
Oh, that's okay. Well, so as you were talking about it, you're saying it's a way of legitimizing the state, but there
Right.
are other ways you could try to do that. You could talk about like a divine appointment theory or something. So social contract theory is a little different than those other theories. Sorry.
Okay.
What was to say? In what way is it different? What makes it distinct?
Yeah, so there's a lot of versions. Even if you just stick to the political interpretation of social contract theory, like appealing to God's authority is a version of that, right? But the other versions would be like saying, if we all agreed amongst ourselves that we're gonna do this, well, that doesn't have to do with politics per se. That is just, we could all agree among ourselves that we're gonna do anything, that we're all gonna wear shoes. Okay, that's not necessarily saying politics has anything to do with it. It's only relates to politics if you say we're all going to agree we're going to wear shoes and we're going to make a law that you have to. That's when you're talking about politics. Otherwise, social contracts can refer to just norms of society, or the culture, our traditions. You know, in a sense, people kind of like agree to the norms of their society when they're living there, but not in the political sense of agreement, you know, and they're not making an actual contract to agree or anything like that.
So like how people didn't spoil the new Spider-Man movie when it first came out. That's like a social contract. We all kind of agreed that we weren't going to do that, right?
Sure,
and so,
yeah, that's a good example.
But in politics, it's as you're saying, it's something a little bit different. So can you explain what social contract theory is in the political sphere?
Yeah, so like I said, there's not, even in the political sphere, there's not one theory. There are many. And especially when you're talking to laymen and not like actual philosophers, they have a whole variety of ways they think, or why they think the government is legitimate, right? And in my book, I try to tackle like the most common reasons people have and the most common arguments they put forth. So yeah, one example would be what people say is, if you don't like it, leave. And the implicit argument behind that, if you were to extract it and make it easier to understand, is they're saying that, in effect, the government owns all the land within its borders, right? All the property. It owns that area. So they're saying it has a right to make the rules. And so if you don't like it, just leave. You know, they're comparing it to a house or someone's home and the rules they make in their house, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't like someone doesn't want you smoking weed in their house, you know, just leave. Don't go to the house anymore. But when you explain all that, you see why that initial claim of if you don't like it, leave, doesn't make a lot of sense for governments, because almost no one actually believes the government literally owns all the property in its territories, especially like libertarian and conservative types, because we appreciate property rights. We appreciate that individuals are the legitimate owners of the property, and the government isn't.
Yeah, it seems to almost go back to like the sort of monarchical system where the king owns all the land and he sort of grants it at his you know.
Yeah.
At his,
well, and in effect, that is what happens with governments, but I don't think anyone thinks that's right. You know, they don't think the government is necessarily the owner like a king would be. They think we are actually the owners.
Yeah, if I have, so then the really the implicit thing, and if you don't like it, leave, is if you're here, you agree, right? You agree to, yeah. Okay. Sure. So okay, so that I think helps a little bit to kind of understand what this idea is. So this social contract theory in a political sphere, as you said, there's different versions of it, but it's something like we all sort of, the government is legitimate because we all sort of agree that we're going to live under it. And so it's not something that's being forced on us. It's something that we assent to, right? Just like when I go in your house, I agree to follow the rules of your house. It's not being forced on me. I don't have to go in your house. And so there's this sort of implicit agreement that I'm entering, that I'm going to follow the rules of the house. Something like that, right?
So yeah, and there, in a very loose sense, you could say we agree to it, but it's not nearly as straightforward as agreeing to be in someone's house. Okay, so as an example, imagine you live in a neighborhood that has a lot of crime. You know, there's just a lot of people in streets and in alleyways that mug people. Now, would we say that you consent to get mugged if you walk down a particular alley at night just because you live in the neighborhood? No, I don't think we would. I mean, that's right. In a sense, you're agreeing to live in the neighborhood, but you're not consenting to certain actions that take place in that neighborhood. And in the case of the social contract theory, you're not consenting necessarily to the government making rules or taxing you.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And then it seems that there's another issue. One issue that comes to my mind immediately is that the social contract theory may sound kind of reasonable in a society where the laws are somewhat reasonable, but you wouldn't necessarily say that you know, in Rwanda, where it was the Hutus who were slaughtering the Tutsis, they agreed to be slaughtered because they lived in Rwanda. Right?
Yeah. No, and I think that's yeah, exactly. But I think that's a good point that, yeah, if the laws are just and are generally really good, most people agree with them, then it becomes more of a consensual relationship. But I don't think, but I still, at the crux of it, I don't think a state, even by just its definition of what a state is, I don't think it can always be, I don't think it can ever be 100% consensual.
Because you're born into it and it's forced on you whether you agree to it or not.
Yeah, because it's just comparison to other things we consent in life, like especially complicated things, because having a government is the most complicated contract you could think of, right? And so you think of, like, if you're just buying a house, the amount of paperwork you have to sign and all the legalities surrounding it is very significant. So where was our opportunity to agree to the thousands or hundreds of thousands of laws that the government creates? You know, we never actually were asked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, to buy a house or get a cell phone contract, there's all these things you have to agree to, because it's understood that if you don't agree to this, then it's not really valid. It's not really a valid agreement. It's not really a valid arrangement. But none of us ever say, yeah, I'm okay with the government putting me in a cage for years of my life if I'm fine with marijuana.
Right. Exactly. And then, but also in a sense, you don't like a criminal, a felon doesn't necessarily need to consent to be punished for crime, right? Or like the victim doesn't need the criminal's consent to defend himself, you know?
Yes.
So there is that nuance that you have to keep in mind. But if you're talking about a state or government in particular, no one gave their actual consent for that organization to tax them and then go actively pursue criminals. So even when the state is doing the best they could do, like punishing real felons, it's still not doing it consensually in a sense, because it didn't ask the population if that's what they want. It did in a sense. There's voting, but it didn't explicitly ask each individual if they want to pay for that service, right? Or how much they want to pay for that service.
Well, and I think that's where the democracy argument comes in, right? Well, if the majority elects these congressmen or supports this ballot initiative, that's enough. That's sufficient. But once again, if the majority of the people in Rwanda are Hutus and they say it's okay to slaughter the Tutsis, then it doesn't really matter what the Tutsis think, right?
Yeah, if the majority does something terrible, it's still unjust. But also, like, I would say democracy is probably the most consensual type of government, but it's still not very consensual, because it's more consensual than having a king, right? Because at least the people do have some say what laws they want, even though I think it's very minimal. But they're still not, it's still not like any private organization. A private organization can't come into a town. Walmart can't come in and say, we're going to take a vote. And if the majority say they only want to buy Walmart products, then that's what's going to happen. And then they're going to force you to pay for Walmart products just because the majority voted so. And that we would think that's ridiculous in a private setting, but we apply completely different standards if it's the government.
So one of the issues then with social contract theory is that even in a democracy, which is one of the more free and consensual models in theory, what I'm trying to say, the consent of the minority is ignored.
Exactly. That's like the definition of democracy. It's that the minority views don't matter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough.
Or you could say even their consent doesn't matter, I think would be more precise.
Yeah, and essentially the state is going to do what it wants without their consent. That mean to them, it could even mean to them, right? So if you look at kind of pre-civil rights laws, where you have a minority of African Americans who are being sort of put upon by the majority. Well, that's just the system working the way it's supposed to. That's the social contract theory. That's democracy. That's all good and fine. But we recognize, I think, that there's something wrong with that thinking, right?
Right, and you could say that, well, the black people didn't get to vote, slaves didn't get to vote, so that's why it wasn't consensual. But I think it's pretty absurd. I mean, they still would have been the minority, and they would have been outvoted, right? So slavery would have been kept.
Yeah.
If the standard was majority rules, which is a pretty poor standard.
So I think I hear someone maybe objecting. Okay, yeah, I think that's probably correct, and it's unfortunate, but it's still maybe the best we can do, right? So, maybe we need just a little bit of tyranny to have a halfway just and peaceful society, and maybe that's just the price we pay. What would you say to that?
So I think I have a pretty nuanced view on this. I would say maybe they're right. I can't know for sure exactly. Maybe we do need a little bit of authoritarianism to stop ourselves from going into complete chaos and mass murder, and civil war. Um, but my best guess is we don't. That's why I'm an anarchist. Because I think if you look at a lot of historical examples, not well, in even the last couple or few hundred years, it's not necessarily that it was complete anarchy, but there are a lot of instances we can look at that had very little to almost no state influence. And I think most people underappreciate how much law and order was created even when the state wasn't actively doing it.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I think there are some examples you give in the book of the wild, wild west, right? So we all know that there wasn't much law in the West, and that's why it was this kind of lawless place where somebody could come into town and terrorize the people, and then you'd have to call on the Magnificent Seven or something to come in and fight off the bad guys.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So yeah, in popular culture, that is the understanding, and even according to a fair amount of historians, that's what happened. But I think most historians, because they don't appreciate the creation of private law and order creation, or they're probably not libertarian or anarchist at all. They just have a different perspective. And so what they're looking at is how much actual government and state enforcement of law there was. And when they see very little, they're going to assume, well, it was just chaos anyway. And so that'll be what they look for and discover. They'll focus on the actual instances where it was very dangerous, and they'll miss everything else. So I read a book when I first started thinking about this years ago. I read a book called The Not So Wild, Wild West. Wish I could remember the author, but you can look it up pretty easy. And I found it very interesting at the time. The author basically talked about a ton of different institutions that created order, like wagon trains. Wagon trains, when they traveled west, beforehand, they would create contracts among all their members, typically. And it would say what the punishment for any crime would be, because, they needed a lot of order and laws, in a sense, on that track. Because if there was some chaos or somebody was acting crazy, it could really jeopardize the mission and people's lives. And so there was just a lot of planning beforehand of everyone agrees that, if you steal from someone on the trip, we're leaving you behind. Things like that. I mean, they're just very strict. And so that's like a very strict sense of like laws, but it was completely privately produced. So another example in the Wild West would be San Francisco. It's about the 1840s. Over a 5-year period, their population grew from like 100 to 20,000 during the gold rush, right? And so the government was way behind and had no chance to catch up to their huge growth and establish a government, or an advanced governmental system of courts and police and stuff. That there was a small government court, but it was just too tiny. It couldn't handle nearly anything. So what happened was the people in San Francisco created private law and order. Essentially, they hired private police, as they're called, to patrol the streets. Like shop owners would come together on a street and hire people to patrol the streets at night to keep, the shop safe and bars safe, especially. And then people in neighborhoods would do the same thing, hire people to walk around their neighborhood, watch for fires primarily, but also to prevent any theft and such. And then there was also private courts alongside the government court. They would actually have a pretty elaborate court system. They'd do everything the government court was doing. They'd present witnesses, make arguments and everything. But then they would hand out their own judgments, and it would be enforced because the people were just so trusting of those private courts. So, today at least they still have the private police system in San Francisco, but I think it's been kind of made a part of the government system and still just called private police. So I don't think it's the same thing, but at least for probably about a couple decades, it was a very private system in San Francisco.
Yeah, well, and obviously, San Francisco nowadays, with much more government involvement, is not necessarily known for being a wonderful place to visit, in at least the last few years, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's too bad because libertarians and anarchists would have loved it for a little while anyway.
And by the way, the book you mentioned, and I actually have it on my Amazon wish list, but haven't read it yet, is The Not So Wild Wild West: Property Rights on the Frontier by Terry L. Anderson and Peter J. Hill.
Yeah, Hill and
Yeah.
Anderson. That actually did come to my mind, but it didn't sound right. So if you just want to read like a summary of that book, they have one. I think it's on the Mises Institute website, called by the same name, I think. And it's a pretty long article detailing all the different private organizations that created law and order on the frontier.
Yeah, and actually, I think that might be where I originally heard about it. Yeah, but I'll add that just in case to my bookmarks.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like what you're sort of saying is that it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that if we had a more libertarian or anarchist society, it would go that bad direction. That we don't necessarily need to have a system where the majority of Hutus can agree to kill the minority of Tutsis in order to have peace and justice and prosperity.
Yeah, no, I don't think we do. But I think in a sense, maybe we do right now, because so many people in our society think, anarchism is ridiculous and is chaos, right? That if suddenly there was anarchism, the first thing to do is build a state, create a government, right? And so, yeah, we achieved anarchism for 10 minutes, but now it's gone again. So I think what you have to do is you have to make slow cultural changes, because people have a bias toward what they understand and know and experience, right? And no one's experienced hardcore libertarianism, or especially not anarchism, right? So they're going to think it's absolutely nuts if it ever did come about, and they'll go crazy, and they'll probably build a terrible government, because that's what people want these days. They want a terrible government. Yeah.
So, well, maybe there might be listeners who imagine something like a violent, disorderly system or whatever when they hear anarchy. What does the word mean to you?
Well, I would call myself a market anarchist in particular. So different schools of anarchism have different interpretations of what anarchism means. But what it means to me is, well, it's the absence of a state. But then it begs the question of what is a state exactly? And a state it's an organization that has the ultimate arbitration power in its territory. So as an example, even in, like, if someone were to take to court the question of, is the government court a legitimate organization? Is it a justified organization? Well, our party that would be deciding whether that's true or false is the court, right? There's obviously a little conflict of interest there. And I think that by itself proves that government courts and other government functions are unjust, and also that the way they operate, and when they operate that way, it shows that they are a government. So that's how I would define government. Or state. That it's when it has superior arbitration authority to every other organization or person. It's seen as being legitimate.
Okay. So then part of what you seem to be proposing is something more like a voluntary social contract. Is that fair, or would you say something a little bit different?
Yeah, I don't like putting it that way, because that might imply, I want everyone to just come together, 300 million people to come together and agree, individually sign that this is what we're going to do. That's not what I want at all. I mean, that I'd be okay with that. That would be really consensual, but obviously that's never going to happen, and I don't necessarily want it to happen. What I mean by a voluntary or anarchist society is that everyone has the same rights they have when they're in the private market or private sector as they do when they're in the government sector. And the government sector usually means at its basic level, it means courts and police and national defense, right? So I want the same relationship we have with Walmart when we go and buy groceries as we do when we want to provide arbitration in courts or security of our home and our work. I want us to be able to hire someone to protect our place of work, our business, right? And that implies it will be consensual because we went out and actually hired the person we want to do it. So basically, I want a whole economy or society ran in that manner, where we acknowledge that people should consent to these type of things.
You kind of mentioned an exception to that earlier, which would be the criminal who violates the rights of others, right? It seems to me, as I'm kind of listening to this, that maybe another way to kind of build this, at least conceptually, is to start by talking about like natural rights. That humans are born with natural rights. Some legal philosophers would call them negative rights. We have a right to not be harmed or molested or killed or violated or whatever.
Right.
But that also means that others have those rights as well, and that if we try to violate those rights that they have a right to defend themselves or ask for remuneration or some kind of compensation for that. And so laws or whatever you want to call them, that just respect those natural rights and the right to compensation are not violations that require voluntary assent, right? It's not like, exactly. Well, I didn't agree that if I murdered this person that I wouldn't have to have consequences for that. Well, you didn't have to agree to that because that person has a natural right. But when it comes to something like, well, I didn't agree to go to prison for the rest of my natural life because I had marijuana in my car. That's different because there's no one whose rights are being violated by that action, and that's where consent is important. Is that maybe fair to say?
Right. So I would say there are two different aspects of anarchism or libertarianism at play here, right? So when I describe what anarchism is, I'm describing how it would function, right? What you're talking about, are goals with anarchism. The goals are that those natural rights are protected as best as we can, right? That's a shared goal with many limited government people. That's what they want. And they just think, limited government is the best way to achieve that. And I think that's a bit naive. But there are, it really depends, even in among like the market anarchists or anarcho-capitalist realm of anarchism, there are varying schools of thought. Like there are some theorists, some authors who would say anarchism is when everyone agrees explicitly via contract that these are going to be our rules, right? And I don't think that's necessary. I just think, I think it's unrealistic. And I think you can build systems privately and different rules and institutions that will defend, for the most part, what we think are natural rights. And at least I think they will do so better than any government system that I've studied.
Okay, good. Fair enough. Okay. I don't want to, I want to be careful about how you use your time here. So I know that you are a Christian. And so what's the relationship of your views on the state and your faith in Christ? How are they related to each other?
Yeah, it's actually kind of a long answer or complicated question anyway. So, I mean, I've kind of been a Christian my whole life. I was raised in a very Catholic family, but I was never, Catholicism, especially when I was young, didn't speak to me at all. And the traditions we did, especially, going to the Catholic schools was extremely boring for a child or a young adult, right? So I never had a good relationship with Christianity or God until, I was older. When I was about 22, 23, it was pretty good. Then it basically disappeared and it all seemed kind of silly. But the past couple of years, again, I'm 30 now. The past couple of years, I've definitely re-evaluated and really started to appreciate Christianity, and I've been developing my closeness with God. And so how much does it influence my political views? A lot. Well, less than I hope, because I was a libertarian. I was hardcore in libertarianism a lot longer than I was hardcore into religion. And so I think a lot of my libertarian views are biasing me in a certain direction of Christianity. Now, I've noticed that, and so I've been trying to make sure that doesn't happen, at least in the last couple of years. And so I think, but I still think there is a lot of compatibility between Christianity and anarchism. If you want an example, for example of a Bible story that is compatible or supports, at least somewhat supports anarchism, is the story when Jesus is in the desert and Satan, one of his temptations, explicitly a temptation, is to offer Jesus the earthly kingdoms of the world. And Jesus laughs at him and acknowledges that is a terrible temptation to do, right? So that should indicate to us that there's something wrong with kingdoms. Another way to say that is there's something wrong with states. This at least was a temptation for Jesus, which I think is a pretty big deal.
Yeah. So, I've got a book that I wrote called "Fight the Powers" that talks about that verse and a few others as well. They're significant. Well, actually, really threads through the Bible that talk about the relationship of negative spiritual powers and state power, political power. And I'm working on another book that's coming out as well, where I kind of delve into that as well. But one thing that sort of occurred to me is you can look to Scripture to ground a lot of these things. This idea that the state is connected to is basically, in the temptation of where Satan tempts Jesus, he says that he has power over the governments of the world and he gives them to whomever he pleases, right. which is even more of an aggressive statement. It means that the state is inherently something that is anti-Christian, right? Yeah. And so you would think, based on that and some of these other passages, that you could make a very compelling case for a strong, thoroughgoing, activist anarchism. And what kind of surprises me when I read the New Testament, especially, is that the approach that seems to kind of be suggested, especially by Paul, is, even though the state is kind of illegitimate, you should just have this sort of attitude of long suffering toward it. And that it's tough to say exactly how far that extends. I do know that even if we were to create this better state that was more anarchistic, it's still not the kingdom of God. So it's right. Deficient, and it's hugely deficient in that sense. So
that's a great point.
Yeah. So I think we can't be thinking in terms of, well, if we do, our political activism can somehow fix the whole thing and everything will be good. But we can, I think in terms of how can we improve. But I guess I sort of feel stuck in between these sort of two places. This one place of sort of Paul's attitude of almost like, well, the state's always going to be around. You're just going to have to figure out how to how to live alongside it, knowing that it's not legitimate. Versus this kind of more anarchistic, well, this would be better. We should do this. We should be more libertarian. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to navigate those two things.
Yeah, well, I think your later point, a lot of people, when they hear you're an anarchist, will respond, or you're just being a utopian. You're being naive. And that relates to, it's still an earthly kingdom. It's not heaven. It's not God's kingdom. We're not aiming for that on earth. We're just aiming for a better system that we think will better protect people and their natural rights, right? I was wondering, did you cover the unto Caesar passage or story in your book?
Yeah, so
the render unto Caesar.
I didn't in the first book because it was more about, it was less about sort of practical, well, there's a little bit of practical stuff, but it's more about kind of tracing this theme through the Bible of demonic and political power conjoined. The new book that I've got coming out is actually called What Belongs to Caesar? And there is an essay on that passage.
Yeah, I found that to be a fascinating passage because the so popular interpretation is that it just means, oh, well, Caesar has a right to take your money. I mean, then you're supposed to give your money to Caesar. You're supposed to pay taxes. That's what Jesus said, right? Which I think is just a really shallow interpretation. There's a lot more subtleties in that story. Jesus I think a more reasonable interpretation is Jesus was making fun of, in a sense, the Pharisees, and say, pointing out that, well, you have Caesar's coin, so give it to him. He may have just been pointing out that, why are you using Caesar's coins? We have our local Jewish currency. We have, you don't need to be involved with Caesar's government policies and schemes. What are you doing that? You're a political leader. I mean,
Yeah,
you're a religious leader.
Yeah.
You should be a religious leader, but instead you're a political leader.
Yeah, well, there's other things going on in that passage too. One of them is, when Jesus ends by saying, "Render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, give back to God what belongs to God." And it's amazing to me is how statists, people who have a strong view in support of the state, don't ever seem to think to ask the question, well, what does belong to Caesar and what does belong to God? And if you go back to some of the early commentators in the early church, they'll say, well, the coin's what belongs to Caesar. Duh, it's his coin. He minted it. What belongs to God? Well, at the very least, men do. The image of God belongs to God, right? And so that means Caesar can't just sort of say, I'm going to dispose of life however I see fit because I'm Caesar. And so, but I think you could go even further than that, and you could say, what belongs to God? Well, everything belongs to God. Of course, God also allows us to have our own private property, and as long as He lets us live and doesn't take it from us. And so, yeah, give the coin back to Caesar. That belongs to Caesar. But that doesn't mean so. But then I think that raises an interesting thought experiment, which is, what about Bitcoin? Bitcoin doesn't belong to the government. So, do you have to tax on Bitcoin? Well, not if you're following that passage. That doesn't say that you have to, right?
Yeah, and you just said that. Yesterday I just shared I think it was a comment from Spike Cohen on Facebook, making that exact argument that Jesus would have had crypto, because it has nothing to do with it wasn't created by governments. It's more of a voluntary and kind of private currency, right? So it's more consensual in that sense. Whoever wants to use it can just use it. Whereas fiat money, government's money, is, there are laws requiring you that you have to pay your taxes in dollars, right? Things like that. And so what that does is it artificially creates or makes the dollar the primary currency that we use, even when we might prefer to use other currencies.
Yeah, well, and I think ultimately what the kind of the non-Anabaptist or sort of pro-statist view of this passage really does is say, well, what belongs to God is your spiritual realm. Of course, you can be a soldier, you can drop, nukes on any city you want. That's fine, because that you're doing that for Caesar. That's your body, but your soul, your spirit, that belongs to God. And so basically, they sort of relegate God to this realm that it's basically like your disembodied spirit. It doesn't have anything to do with what you do or how you live. It's just, how you feel inside. And then everything else belongs to Caesar, which is not, I don't think what Jesus is trying to say.
Yeah, because especially you think about, I think like the first 200 years of Christianity, Christians, from what I understand, they didn't serve in the army. They didn't hold political office. They never tried to achieve anything like that. And then for some time they were prosecuted for doing Christian acts like praying to God, but they still did it anyway because they knew that was more important, and they knew that the earthly kingdom was something separate entirely.
Yeah, actually, it was roughly the first 300 years, and there are some exceptions. There's evidence that some Christians served in the military, probably partly because they were converted while they were in the army. But you do have pretty much unanimous support from the church fathers on that not being acceptable. I think is it Tertullian? Tertullian, early in his career, says something about Christians serving in the military. He's writing in the mid 100s, and he says something. He's kind of maybe approving of it. It's kind of neutral. But then later on, he basically, I think he comes full stop against Christians in the military, and but I think he's really the only exception in those first 300 years of Christians saying anything positive about serving in the military, and then he changed his mind.
Yeah. So it might, the more subtle point might be that Christians shouldn't engage in violence if they don't need to. like just being in the military in general. But I think Christianity and like Jesus would prefer, if you were going to fight, you did it in a more consensual organization than the state, as in you weren't paid through taxed money. You were just defending your neighborhood and your homes, and maybe you're, in the Jewish community, maybe defending Jewish people from outside invasions. And, government militaries, that's just usually not what they do. Like the U.S. government today, most of what it does is interfere in other countries. Like defending us is just like a byproduct. And sometimes interfering in other countries makes our defense more vulnerable.
Yeah, you could make that argument. I would say, for me, the connection between my my political views and my religious views is that I think Jesus is pretty full stop nonviolent. Now, I would qualify that to some extent by saying, perhaps using minimal force to sort of slow somebody down who's trying to hurt somebody else, or stop them, or restrain them. I don't necessarily think that's bad, but I think it's very reasonable to ask, am I loving my neighbor if I blow their brains out? I think it's hard to come up with an example where that works.
Right.
And so what we usually do is we say, well, we hate this one, but we do it to love somebody else, or do it to love ourselves. But I think for me, that's part of why I can't get behind, like you talked about, like an anarchistic utopianism, is because I think this side of the second coming of Jesus, violence is still going to be something that happens. And so even if we don't have a state, you're still going to have consensual police forces. You're still going to have some violence, some perhaps some battles even. And so I think you still have, as a Christian, you still have to ask yourself, where do I fit into that? And so whether it's a state or not, there's still going to be things that Christians are going to have to, I think, pull back from in society.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And so my point was more so that, if you were to join like a private security force rather than being in the military that is invading other countries, I think that would move you more in the direction, at least, of what is being more Christian, right? And maybe when you're in that private security force, maybe you're trying to make it less violent in their actions. Maybe instead of shooting like a robber, maybe we do everything we can to just pin him down physically, or even not a robber. You could probably just let him go, even, but like someone trying to murder someone, right? Yeah. Maybe we don't shoot him in the head as our first reaction. Maybe we do what's more practical for not letting anyone get hurt. You know what I mean? Depending on the situation.
Sure. Well, yeah, and private security is generally going to be looking for those opportunities to not go to the extreme, because it's a big headache. It's a PR nightmare. Right. So unless you're a private security corporation or firm that works for the military, you rarely hear about private security, shooting people like you do police, right? And so that's yeah. So that's go ahead. I was going to say it fits into a harm reduction strategy, right?
Yeah.
It's not the kingdom of God, but it's harm reduction.
Yeah, and so that's part of the reason why anarchism and just private alternatives to these services are better, right? People they have to deal with the clapback of their customers, the response, the outrage if they kneel on someone in the middle of the street and leave them on their neck and they die. Which, I mean, the government police still had some backlash, but a lot of the times they don't.
Yeah. Well, and in most cases, the officers protected. That was one instance where, because the public outcry was so aggressive and so strong, they had to do something about it.
Right. But I think the difference between the private and the government is both. You can be outraged at both, right? But at least for the private company, you can say, okay, I'm not going to be your customer anymore because you treat people too violently. With the government, you can't do that. You still got to pay your taxes. They're still going to have a police force, even if you hate the way they handle security.
Yeah. And a private security officer who does something like that is going to be fired at least, right? And he's not going to be insured either. So if somebody who has done something like that is not going to be able to get private insurance, they're not going to be able to afford it, right? Whereas the way it works right now with the state is a police officer can do all these horrible things. They would be uninsurable in the open market. But because basically we, the taxpayers, are going to pay for all the lawsuits and things that they do, that they bring up.
Right. And that's why I think enacting laws that require police officers to have insurance like that would be a step in the right direction, because it would be making it more like a private security force, at least a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We've been talking about 45 minutes now. Can you just maybe wrap up by just telling folks how to get a hold of the book?
Yeah, it's just on Amazon, an ebook and or paperback. It's just The Myth of the Social Contract on Amazon, pretty easy to find. There is another Andrew Kern author, so probably don't search by just my name. He writes about education, I think. You could also, I have a website where pretty much every article I've ever written and blog is on there, principledlibertarian.com. But I don't publish much on there anymore, but all my old writing is pretty much. Now I just, right now anyway, I have a public Facebook page, and it's at Andrew Kern Author. And everything I've been writing goes on there. I have blog posts and then shorter stuff too.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm going to make sure I link to those sites for folks who are interested, and I appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you. It's good to talk to you.
You too.